In the year 1526, a king in the heart of Africa sat down to write a letter that would echo across centuries. His words were desperate, his tone urgent. He wrote not to a neighbor or ally, but to a man across an ocean who called himself brother. The letter spoke of corruption, of greed, of a trade in human souls that was devouring his kingdom from within. This was no ordinary African ruler. This was Afonso I of Congo, a man who embraced European Christianity with such fervor that the Vatican itself called him an ally. A man who built churches and schools in his capital when most of Europe was still recovering from medieval darkness. A man who believed that faith and diplomacy could forge a new world. But King Afonso would learn a bitter truth that haunts us even today, that good intentions mean nothing when faced with the machinery of greed. To understand Afonso's tragedy, we must first understand his world. The Kingdom of Congo in the late 15th century was not some minor chiefdom waiting for European enlightenment. It was a sophisticated state, a sprawling empire that stretched across what we now call Angola, the Republic of Congo, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The capital, Mbanza Congo, was a city of power and ceremony, where the Mani Congo, the king of Congo, held court over a complex hierarchy of nobles, governors, and advisors. The kingdom was organized into provinces, each ruled by appointed officials who owed their allegiance to the throne. Trade routes crisscrossed the land, carrying copper, ivory, raffia cloth, and Nzimbu shells that served as currency throughout the region. The Congolese people worshipped according to ancient traditions. They believed in Nzambi Ampongu, a creator deity who gave birth to the universe and the spirits that inhabited it. But the heart of their faith lay in ancestor veneration. The dead were not gone. They were guardians, protective spirits called Bakulu who watched over their descendants and guided the living. Every major decision, every ceremony, every transition of power involved communication with these ancestral spirits. Religion was not separate from politics in Congo. It was politics. The king's legitimacy flowed not just from military might or administrative skill, but from his connection to the spiritual realm, his ability to channel the wisdom and power of those who came before. Into this world, in 1483, came the Portuguese. They arrived not as conquerors with armies and cannons, though those would come later. They came as traders and missionaries, bearing gifts of European goods and promises of partnership. The Portuguese were impressed by what they found. Here was an African kingdom with organization, with wealth, with diplomatic sophistication. And the Congolese elite, for their part, were intrigued by these strange visitors with their ships that crossed oceans, their firearms, their literacy, and their passionate devotion to a foreign god. In 1491, something extraordinary happened. King Nzinga, the ruler of Congo, made a decision that would transform his nation forever. He converted to Christianity, taking the baptismal name Joan I. It was not conquest or coercion that led to this moment, but genuine interest, strategic calculation, and perhaps a recognition of spiritual resonance between the Christian God and the Congolese understanding of the divine. Standing beside his father at that baptism was a young prince, the king's son, who took the name that history would remember, Afonso. Afonso's conversion was not a political performance. From the very beginning, he was a true believer. As a young man, he was given authority over the province of Nsundi, and he used that position to promote Christianity with an enthusiasm that surprised even the Portuguese missionaries. He built churches, he studied scripture, he learned to read and write Portuguese. While his father, Joan I, eventually returned to traditional Congolese religion, disillusioned by broken Portuguese promises and the demands Christianity placed on royal customs, Afonso never wavered. For him, Christianity was not just a foreign import. It was a path to knowledge, to connection with the wider world, to power both spiritual and temporal. When Joan I died in 1506, the kingdom stood at a crossroads. Afonso was not in the capital. He was in his provincial seat when news of his father's death reached him, and immediately a crisis erupted. Afonso's half-brother Mpanzu Akitima moved to seize the throne. Mpanzu represented the traditional faction, those nobles and priests who saw Christianity as a corrupting foreign influence, who wanted to return Congo to its ancestral ways. He had the support of many powerful figures in Mbanza Congo. He had proximity to the throne. He had momentum, but Afonso had something else. He had the support of the Portuguese settlers in the capital, and he had an unshakable conviction that God was on his side. The two brothers met in battle outside Mbanza Congo, and what happened next became legend. According to accounts that spread throughout the kingdom, at the moment of crisis, when Afonso's forces seemed outnumbered and outmatched, a vision appeared in the sky. Some said it was St. James, the warrior saint, riding on a white horse. Others described a bright cross that filled the heavens. Whether it was divine intervention, clever psychology, or simply the effect of Portuguese firearms, the result was decisive. Mpanzu's forces broke and fled. Afonso marched into Mbanza Congo as its undisputed king. What followed was one of the most remarkable reigns in African history. Afonso did not simply accept Christianity as a veneer over traditional power. He attempted to fundamentally transform Congolese society into a Christian kingdom that could stand as an equal to the European powers. His capital was renamed São Salvador. Churches were built throughout the city, constructed of stone by Portuguese craftsmen working alongside Congolese laborers. The first stone church was completed on the 1st day of June, 1491, and under Afonso's rule, many more followed. He established schools for both boys and girls by 1516, an era when literacy was still rare in much of Europe. At its height, over 1,000 students studied in the capital, learning Portuguese, Latin, and Christian theology alongside traditional Congolese knowledge. Afonso centralized governmental power in his own hands, curtailing the authority of the provincial nobility who had long held semi-autonomous power. He expanded the kingdom's borders through military campaigns, pushing Congo's influence further south and east. He established a royal treasury funded by taxation, breaking the old system where nobles controlled most of the kingdom's wealth. He created a bureaucracy staffed by literate Christians who owed their positions to the king rather than to hereditary noble status. In every way, Afonso was building a modern state, and he dreamed bigger still. In 1513, Afonso sent his son Enrique to Rome, to the Vatican itself, to study for the priesthood. It was an audacious move, unprecedented in the relationship between Christian Europe and sub-Saharan Africa. Enrique studied in Portugal, mastered Latin and theology, and in 1518 he was consecrated as a bishop with the title In Partibus Infidelium, in the lands of the infidels. Enrique became the first sub-Saharan African Catholic bishop in history, a symbol of what Afonso believed was possible, a Congolese church that was truly Congolese, not dependent on European priests and European authority. But indigenous and equal, Afonso did not see himself as a subject or a vassal. He corresponded with the Portuguese kings as a fellow monarch, addressing them as brothers. He wrote to the Pope. He maintained his own diplomatic agenda. He understood that the Europeans possessed technological and organizational knowledge that could benefit Congo, and he wanted that knowledge. He requested teachers, craftsmen, priests, physicians. He sent young Congolese nobles to study in Lisbon, building a cadre of educated elites who could bridge the African and European worlds. For a brief moment, it seemed like it might work. It seemed like Congo might become what Afonso envisioned, a Christian African kingdom that dealt with Europe not as a victim, but as a partner, that took what was useful from European civilization while maintaining its own sovereignty and identity. But there was a poison growing at the heart of this relationship, and its name was slavery. Slavery was not new to Africa or to Congo. Like most pre-modern societies, Congo had enslaved people, prisoners of war, criminals, debtors. But this was domestic slavery, integrated into the social fabric, nothing like what was beginning to emerge in the Atlantic world. The Portuguese had established sugar plantations on the islands of São Tomé and Príncipe, off the African coast. Sugar required intensive labor, and the Portuguese had discovered that enslaved Africans could be worked to death growing it, then replaced with fresh captives. There was profit in this system, enormous profit, and profit has a way of overriding every other consideration. At first, Afonso cooperated. He understood slavery as a limited exchange. Prisoners from Congo's wars of expansion, criminals, people who were already enslaved under Congolese law. He established a commission to regulate the trade, to ensure that only legitimate slaves were exported. He believed he could control it, manage it, make it serve Congo's interests while maintaining the partnership with Portugal. He was wrong. Portuguese merchants, joined by other Europeans, descended on Congo like locusts. They did not wait for legitimate captives from judicial proceedings or military campaigns. They worked with corrupt Congolese nobles, with brigands and kidnappers, with anyone who would supply them with human beings. Free Congolese citizens were seized from their homes, their farms, and their families. Children disappeared. Whole villages were raided. The social fabric of the kingdom began to tear. By 1526, Afonso had seen enough. He sat down and wrote the first of what would become a series of 24 letters to King João III of Portugal, letters that are among the most important documents in African history. His words were blunt, his desperation clear. He described how the Portuguese merchants cared for nothing but profit, how they corrupted Congolese nobles with trade goods, how they purchased people who had no legal right to be enslaved. He wrote that his own subjects, even sons of nobles and members of his own family, were being taken. He wrote that the corruption was so great that even his inspectors, appointed to regulate the trade, could not be trusted. In one letter, his anguish pours off the page. "We cannot reckon how great the damage is," he wrote, "since the merchants are taking every day our natives, sons of the land, and the sons of our noblemen and vassals, and our relatives." He described how the Portuguese distributed goods throughout the kingdom to create networks of collaborators, how they turned Congolese against each other, and how greed was destroying the social bonds that held the kingdom together. The trade, he wrote, was depopulating his country. People were fleeing to other regions to escape the slavers. The kingdom was being hollowed out. Afonso begged the Portuguese king to intervene, to regulate his merchants, to honor the partnership they had claimed to value. He threatened to close the trade entirely if Portugal would not control its citizens. He appealed to their shared Christian faith, to the brotherhood they had proclaimed. He wrote not just to Portugal, but to the Vatican, to bishops, to anyone who might listen. And the response, when it came, was silence. Or worse, empty promises that meant nothing. The Portuguese crown made sympathetic noises, issued proclamations that were never enforced, and sent officials who were as corrupt as the merchants themselves. Because the truth was simple and terrible, the slave trade was too profitable to stop. The Portuguese economy was beginning to depend on it. The merchants had too much power. And a Christian African king, no matter how educated or diplomatic or faithful, could not compete with the mathematics of greed. Afonso's later years were marked by increasing isolation and disillusionment. His beloved son, Henrique, returned to Congo from Europe around 1526, but died just a few years later, possibly in 1531, taking with him Afonso's dream of an indigenous Congolese clergy. The Portuguese presence in the kingdom grew more arrogant, more extractive. They no longer pretended that Congo was an equal partner. They built their own settlements, followed their own laws, treated Congolese territory as if it belonged to them by right. Afonso continued to resist. He continued to write letters, to protest, to demand that Portugal honor its commitments. But he was fighting a current too strong to resist. The Atlantic slave trade was becoming an institution, a vast machinery of suffering that would eventually transport more than 12 million African people across the ocean, that would fuel the economies of Europe and the Americas, that would leave scars on Africa that have not healed to this day. When Afonso died in 1542, or possibly 1543, he died still believing, still hoping that reason and faith might prevail. He died still a Christian, still convinced that the principles he had embraced were true, even if the Europeans who brought them had betrayed everything they claimed to believe. The kingdom he had worked so hard to build began to fragment almost immediately. His death sparked succession disputes. The Portuguese grew bolder in their exploitation. The social disruption, caused by decades of slave raiding, weakened Congo's military and administrative capacity. Over the following century, the Kingdom of Congo would descend into civil war, fragmentation, and eventually, in 1665, catastrophic military defeat at the hands of the Portuguese at the Battle of Mbwila. The kingdom never recovered. It became a shadow of what it had been, carved up by European powers, its people scattered and enslaved, its capital reduced to ruins. Over the next 300 years, more than a third of the Congolese population would be deported as slaves, torn from their homeland and scattered across the Americas. But Afonso's legacy is more complicated than simple failure. He was a man caught between worlds, trying to navigate an impossible situation with intelligence, faith, and determination. His letters remain some of the most articulate condemnations of the slave trade ever written, penned not by abolitionists centuries later, but by an African king watching in real time as his kingdom was destroyed. He proved that Africans were not passive victims waiting for history to happen to them, but active agents making choices, building institutions, engaging with global forces. Afonso's story also reveals something uncomfortable about faith and power, about how ideals can be weaponized and how partnership can become exploitation. He believed in the universality of Christianity, in the possibility of genuine brotherhood across cultures and continents. He was not naive. He was a sophisticated political operator who understood very well what he was doing, but he could not have anticipated how thoroughly economic interests would corrupt the very people who claimed to share his faith. The Europeans who brought Christianity to Congo, who baptized its kings and built its churches, had no problem whatsoever with enslaving Christians, with destroying a Christian kingdom, with betraying every principle they claimed to hold sacred when profit was on the line. The tragedy of Afonso I is not that he was foolish or weak. It is that he was fighting an enemy he could not see clearly, an enemy that wore the mask of friendship even as it destroyed him. It is the tragedy of every leader who has tried to navigate imperial power in terms of equality, who has believed that civilization and Christianity and diplomacy meant something more than just tools of domination. It is the tragedy of hope itself when faced with institutionalized evil. Today, if you travel to northern Angola, you can still visit Mbanza, Congo, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The ruins of churches Afonso built still stand, weathered by centuries but present. The city is regarded by Congo-speaking people throughout Central Africa as their spiritual capital, a reminder of a time when an African kingdom stood at the crossroads of history and chose a path that seemed to lead toward partnership and progress. Local tradition speaks of the Cathedral of the Holy Savior, called Nkulum-Bimbi, said to have been built by angels overnight, a story that captures something true, even if not literally factual. That what happened in Congo under Afonso was remarkable, almost miraculous, a brief moment when it seemed like the story might end differently. Afonso's letters, preserved in Portuguese archives, are now studied by historians around the world. His voice reaches across 5 centuries, bearing witness to one of history's greatest crimes. He was a man of his time, with all the limitations that implies. He was a king who waged war, who ruled with absolute authority, who never questioned monarchy itself as a system. He was complicit in slavery before he understood what the Atlantic slave trade would become. He was not a modern democrat or a revolutionary. He was an African king trying to preserve his kingdom's power and independence in a rapidly changing world. But he was also something more. He was a man who learned, who changed his mind when confronted with evidence of evil, who spent the last decades of his life fighting against an injustice he had once participated in. He was a man who believed that words mattered, that appeals to conscience and faith and shared humanity might actually change behavior. In that belief, he was tragically wrong in his own time, but perhaps not wrong for all time, because Afonso's letters did matter, just not soon enough to save his kingdom. They became part of the long historical record that eventually turned public opinion against slavery. They proved that Africans resisted from the very beginning, that the narrative of passive acceptance was always a lie. They showed that an African king could be as literate, as diplomatic, as morally sophisticated as any European monarch, undermining every racist justification that would later be used to legitimize colonialism. When we look at King Afonso I of Congo, we see a mirror held up to the world he encountered. We see what happens when moral language is divorced from moral action, when faith becomes a tool of empire rather than a force for justice, when economic systems develop that treat human beings as commodities. We see the birth of the modern world, with all its promise and all its horror. And we see a man who tried with everything he had to steer that world towards something better. His failure was not his alone. It was the failure of everyone who had the power to stop what was happening and chose not to. It was the failure of the Portuguese kings who received his letters and did nothing. It was the failure of the Catholic Church, which was content to baptize kingdoms while ignoring the enslavement of Christians. It was the failure of a European civilization that was learning to talk about human dignity while building an economic system based on human exploitation. And perhaps that is Afonso's final gift to us, a warning. His story reminds us that good intentions change nothing without the will to back them with action, that faith without justice is empty, that the language of partnership means nothing when one partner has all the guns. It reminds us that the forces of greed and dehumanization are always waiting at the edges of civilization, ready to turn progress into predation. It reminds us that the price of passivity in the face of injustice is measured in centuries of suffering. In the heart of Africa, a king once built churches and schools, sent his sons to study in Rome, and believed that knowledge and faith could forge a better world. He wrote letters filled with eloquence and anguish, pleading for justice, demanding accountability, speaking truth to power. He fought against the darkness with the only weapons he had: words, faith, and an unshakable belief in human dignity. The darkness won in his lifetime, but his words remain testament to resistance, evidence of conscience, proof that the capacity for moral clarity exists in every time and every place if we choose to exercise it. King Afonso I of Congo was defeated, but he was not wrong about what mattered. And that, perhaps, is the only victory history allows.